I am Sabra Boyd, and I'm going to be going over media relations and how to be savvy and safe when talking to reporters. Just a note, I'll be using the word journalist and reporter interchangeably. So, a little bit about me. I am a freelance investigative journalist, and I am also a child trafficking survivor. I also co wrote the Survivor Storytelling Workbook with Chris Ash at National Survivor Network. Um, I really kind of ended up becoming a journalist because I was so frustrated with how our stories are told as trafficking survivors. So I did not go to journalism school, but I am self-trained and have gone to a lot of workshops and things like that to learn the trade of journalism. But I think it's so important to share kind of the unspoken, unwritten rules of talking to a reporter so that you know what your rights are and kind of just how to navigate the jargon and the different unspoken rules, really. So journalism is really about communicating issues clearly to the public. So when you do decide to talk to a journalist, always be thinking about what do you need the public to know and try to think in a very focused way about that. Like maybe just one or two really clear points that you want to keep coming back to. So I would argue that storytelling is the oldest technology in human history. You know, some of the first stories might have been something like a story about like why you shouldn't eat that red berry because it's poisonous. We as humans are really hardwired to understand information better if it's told in the form of a story. And so while data and statistics are really important, that's going to like be way too boring for most people to really listen to. So a lot of times telling stories that highlight and illustrate certain data points and facts and things, it's just going to be a lot more powerful if you put a face to the data. So it's important to think, do I even want to share my story? And that's a really personal decision. And that decision might also change over time. Like sometimes you might want to share your story, and then you might get really burnt out and have just a lot going on, and it's not the right time for you to share your story a year later. And that's completely okay. Be graceful, or give yourself grace and just like let that happen as it does. So, what I'm trying to say is you want to think about what's at stake for you if you speak publicly, and what do you want to make sure that the audience knows. So, yeah, like I said before, just try to keep it really focused on what the audience needs to know. And also, if you don't want to share your story, that is okay. There are plenty of other ways that you can help behind the scenes. So you also want to think about how to introduce yourself to the audience. This can include things like the spelling of your name, or maybe you need to be anonymous, and in which case you would tell the reporter, I need to remain anonymous or use a pseudonym because this could jeopardize like my career or my family or my safety, things like that. Also, if it's important to let them know pronouns, ethnicity, title, things like that. And your title can mean whatever you think is most focused to what the interview is about. So, for a story about trafficking, I might introduce myself as Sabra Boyd is a trafficking survivor who has studied homelessness and the root causes of trafficking for 20 years or something like that. You can also think about how this might be an opportunity to establish your expertise. So, getting your name out there, maybe you are a social work student and you want to mention that in your interview. And then you might end up getting like job opportunities from this platform. So, be thinking strategically like that. And then any other information that you think is important for them to know and how they might introduce you to the audience. So, most reporters and journalists are not trauma informed. It's important to go in knowing that. This is all the more reason for you to know what your rights are as an interviewee and also how to set clear boundaries with the reporter who's interviewing you. So, that can look a number of ways. Um, at any point, if you're uncomfortable or they say something offensive, you are completely within your right to end the interview. Also, know that that might be reflected in the story. So, if you end the interview, they might include that in the article. Which is why it's important to vet reporters up front to see other things that they've written, to kind of do your homework and see, is this someone that I actually trust with my story? Is this someone that I trust to portray it accurately. And yeah, so we'll go over that a little bit more later, but just know that this going in, that most reporters are not trauma informed, unfortunately. And there's a huge power differential. The reporter obviously has like a lot more power in the situation, but you have every right to say, I don't feel comfortable answering that question, something like that. And then think about whether you need any accommodations. Do you need an interpreter? Do you prefer a phone or a Zoom interview? Or do you prefer to see them in person if possible? Some people really don't like Zoom and would prefer to just do an audio interview over the phone, and that's totally okay to ask for. You can ask for written questions in advance if you want to, but most editors and reporters will prefer to have like an organic conversation. And actually, I would argue that that is usually better because they might ask you something about, trying to think of an example, but they might ask you something that ends up going in a different direction than they expected, or your answer, they might have a very incorrect misconception about something. So when they ask you a question and you answer it a way that they didn't expect, it might just end up leading the interview in a very different direction than they expected. And that's a good thing. Like a good reporter is not going to know the ending or the conclusion of the story when they start. Like they're going to follow where the story takes them, and try not to have, preconceived notions. And then let's see, internet access, phone access. Maybe you don't have access to a phone right now, in which case you might want to ask for an interview in person. And within reason, the journalist should accommodate these things. I guess like one thing that would be too big of a request is like a private jet to come pick you up or something. But within reason, they should accommodate you. So think about who the audience is that you want to reach. That could be judges, lawyers, local politicians, or national or international politicians, maybe specific neighbors in a neighborhood, police officers, social workers, just general taxpayers, or maybe you want millionaires and billionaires to be knowing what you're sharing in the interview, business owners, city council, or maybe there's just one specific person you have in mind that you really, if you're imagining who you're speaking to, sometimes that's helpful. What are the takeaways? So before you have an interview, it's helpful to think of a list of like the top 1, 2, 3 to 5 things that you want the audience to know, and that'll help you stay focused. Sometimes I'll write those down. It really helps my anxiety to have written notes. So I'll write down, the top 2 things that I want the audience to know, just so that I keep coming back to that focus, because otherwise I can, end up talking about something very unrelated if I don't stay focused. Is this the right reporter or journalist or publication for my story? So you want to kind of Google who the reporter is, look at some of their past stories, look at some of their past interviews, and see, is this someone that I can trust with my story? You also want to research the outlet, the publication, and sometimes that just means like asking a few friends. Like occasionally there are publications where I'm like, I don't know if this is a magazine that I actually want to be involved with. And even after like looking at their past issues and like their Wikipedia page, I'm still not sure. So I'll ask a couple of friends and kind of get an idea of how they're perceived. And yeah. And then you also want to think about, is there a journalist that I want to reach out to first? If you have a story tip, like maybe you have an art project that you are displaying, and you want to get the word out so that more people come to see it. Who are like the reporters that you would trust with that story? Maybe arts reporters, or if it's an art project about human trafficking, are there specific reporters who have covered human trafficking stories that might be a good fit? Yeah, so just be thinking strategically like that as well. But you always want to vet reporters. You always want to read some of the things that they've published before, just to see if you think that you can trust them. So with recording, a lot of So most of the time your interview will be recorded, and this is actually a good thing because it'll ensure that the transcript is more accurate so that you're not likely to be misquoted or something like that. And in most states, journalists have to ask at the very beginning, is it okay for me to record this? Um, and let's see, trying to think of what else to go over with that. Your interview might be over the phone or over Zoom. Yeah, and one thing I will say is, so on the record is one thing that we should cover. So something is on the record when they can quote you, they can attribute, the quote to your name, saying, Sabra Boyd said dot dot dot. If there is any detail that you want off the record, you can ask them to pause the recording, stop recording, and then say that little bit. But you do it's better to try to just stay on the record with everything, if possible, because it's really an exercise in trust, right? Yeah. Oh, and then if you have any preferences regarding how the recording is used, make sure to tell them up front and be transparent about any concerns that you have. So in the past, when I've recorded people for interviews, a couple of them have said, like, you're not going to use this for a podcast, like a podcast audio clip or something. And I always say, like, I don't do that anyway. So the answer is always no, like, I'm just using this for an accurate transcription. And then if that were to change at any point, I would go back to them and ask for permission. So your rights as an interviewee, like I said, you can stop the interview at any time. You can say that you don't want to talk about something, even if the reporter is pushy. They might try to ask repeatedly or rephrase the question. Um, there's also the issue of trauma porn. If you feel like they're just trying to get you to recount graphic details of a traumatic experience, you don't have to do that. You can ask to pause, take a break, or resume another day, especially if it's a really heavy, intense interview about something traumatic. You can ask to remain anonymous or to use an alias, and reporters and editors will usually agree to this if you say that it's for safety reasons or for your livelihood and job. And even if you're not employed right now, you can still say that you would be concerned about job prospects, down the road and how you might be perceived publicly. And then at the end, you can also say, I want to make sure to add something, maybe something that they forgot to ask about. You can also have notes if that helps you with your anxiety, especially like if there are specific dates or things like that that you want to make sure to touch on. Most journalists won't want you to answer questions via email, but if this is the only format that you feel comfortable with, you can do that. Or you can ask for that. They might say no, though. So photos and film, you do not need to provide a photo or consent to be filmed if you don't want to. If this is a television interview, then that might, they might say, well, we can't have you on in that case, and that's okay. Most reporters are not trauma informed and will likely not understand why you're asking to not provide a photo, but you can be firm with this if this is a boundary that you have. And just a reminder, what you don't say can't be misquoted or printed. So be thinking about how sound bites that you say might be quoted and pulled. You don't have control over what quotes they end up gravitating towards. So just be thinking strategically. And if you don't want to tell your story, but you still want to help set the record straight, or you still want to, share information that you feel is important, there are lots of other things you can do. You can help with research. You can email reporters, hey, I think that you really need to look at this study, or I think that you should, maybe consider interviewing these other people. And you can help with documentation and fact checking. You can help find other sources. So maybe a reporter reaches out to you and says, hey, can you talk to me about your experience with with the legal system or restitution or something? And maybe you don't feel up to doing an interview and sharing your own story, but you've asked a friend that went through something similar and they do want to be interviewed. You can then offer to connect the two people. But I would recommend asking your friend first, can I introduce you to this reporter? So that it doesn't just come out of nowhere. You can also suggest other angles and aspects of the story to the reporter because, like I said, most reporters are not trauma informed, and so they really don't, they might not understand all the aspects of a story. Um, like I'm trying to think of a specific example of that. Um, well, like with homelessness, I think a lot of reporters don't understand, just what it's like to not have your basic needs met. So you can reach out to reporters and tell them, like, hey, you didn't, you missed this part. Try to word it in a way that they're not going to be really defensive, but say something like, hey, have you ever considered like looking at the story from this angle instead? Something like that. You can also speak on background or off the record, but again, that is an exercise in trust that the reporter is not going to quote you with your name attributed. But speaking on background means that you're just kind of giving them like a lay of the land and saying, well, there's this issue and there's this issue. I guess I'll just use the example of homelessness again. Like maybe you tell them, there's this homeless camp that is, in dire need of access to like hand washing stations or something, and they were swept from this other neighborhood where they were before, and things like that. Like maybe you don't want to be named in that, so you're just speaking on background and kind of pointing them in the right direction. So journalism jargon to know on the record means that they're quoting you and they're attributing it to your name. Although if you need to be anonymous, tell them that up front and kind of negotiate that term. Off the record means that they're not quoting you directly. But again, it's an exercise in trust. So make sure that it's a reporter that you do trust to follow that. On background means that you're just kind of giving them some background information to give them an idea of details that they might not fully understand or know. So some controversial and unspoken rules. Publications will not pay you for your interview. There are exceptions to this, but it's mostly tabloids with a lot of strings attached, and usually they're not ethical or respected publications. This is specifically about the US. It's a little bit different in the UK. But examples of this are Trump and Weinstein. They used tabloids to pay people for their stories and then had them sign NDAs so that they couldn't share the story with anyone else. And that's part of how they really controlled their perception in the public, by basically buying people's stories. And yeah, so in a lot of ways, it's actually good to not be paid for your story when you're being interviewed. Obviously, if you're, writing an essay or something like that, I do want you to definitely be paid as a writer. But as far as an interviewee, it's usually better to not be paid for your story because that means that there won't be any, strings attached. And I think it's also important to think about what are your motivations for talking to the press. Yeah, just not, there's no wrong answer to that, but just, kind of consider that. Most journalists will disagree with me on this, but you can request to review paragraphs where you've been paraphrased or quoted to make sure that your words are not taken out of context or misunderstood. So just keep in mind that if you do ask to read the paragraph where they've quoted you, the deadline is likely that same day or very soon. So you want to review it immediately and get back to them with any criticism or feedback or notes or something. And then prepare yourself for them saying no. They might say no. So maybe you don't want to be interviewed at all. That's completely okay. And maybe you want to tell your story yourself with an essay or a memoir or something like that. That is perfectly fine too. You have the option of op-eds, personal essays, podcasts, or other other platforms and outlets. Like you can definitely tell your story yourself. I will say that being publicly identified as a survivor, I have had most editors tell me that they will not publish anything I write about trafficking, and I'm not able to cover like trials or any stories about trafficking because they think that I'd be too biased. And I've even offered to, to tell, to talk about any conflicts of interest and just say that up front. I've also, pitched stories about trafficking that were not, types of trafficking that I've experienced myself. And so like I'm constantly told that I can't cover stories about trafficking, but that's as a journalist. It's different as, personal essays and op-eds and things like that. Um, I will say that op-eds are usually paid less than personal essays. Um, anyway, but I do have a separate training about pitching and publishing and where I go into that in more detail. So press releases. So you have the option of putting out a press release with a group that you're part of. So that could be, it could look any number of ways. Like maybe you are going to Congress to speak and testify about something. Like maybe you want to put together a press release with other survivors that you're doing that with. It could also be a press release from, I did help like a homeless camp put together a press release. Yeah, so that can look any number of ways, and that can be an alternative to doing interviews, but still getting the word out there and getting your perspective out there. Um, and then you'll also want to work with the group that you're doing the press release with to make sure that you're all on the same page about specific talking points. So you want to prepare and cope ahead for the potential challenges and benefits. So some challenges that you might face is backlash, criticism, trolls, doxing. So these are all safety concerns. So I would say never read the comments. That's the first. That's the first thing, right? And then as far as doxing, you want to try to have your address be confidential if possible. There are different services that you can use for this, like Delete Me is a really great service. It costs I want to say it costs like $10 a month, but it's a very like valuable $10 a month. And then let's see, parasocial relationships and fans. So occasionally someone will read an interview that you've done or something that you've written, and they'll really resonate with it, and they'll feel like this is the first time that they've ever heard someone else speak about something that reflects their own experience. So they will feel really connected with you, and they might email you like every single day and tell you extremely graphic details of their trauma. You are not paid enough to be their therapist. There are a number of ways that you can handle this. One way that I handle it is not to say that this is like the way that you should, but the way that I usually handle it is I email them back and I say, thank you for sharing your story with me. I'm really sorry that happened to you. I try to keep it short, but also compassionate. And sometimes they'll keep emailing me. And I try to most of the time I try to gently say thank you and be compassionate. But like I said, like I don't have the time, space, or emotional energy to be a therapist to the hundreds of people that might be emailing me in one week. But at the same time, I do recognize that it feels really good to be seen, right? Like I experienced that when I was younger too, like seeing an interview that really resonated with me and I really connected with that person. But yeah, self-care is community care. And then trauma dumping, I kind of touched on this earlier about someone sharing really graphic details of their abuse. You don't need to respond to that. That's not yours to carry. And also, maybe they just needed to send that email to someone and kind of like a journal entry, and then they feel better. So potential benefits, and so there might be opportunities for future like speaking engagements, things like that. It might give you more publicity, potentially like job offers or book deals or something like that, if those are things that you want. It might also help with legislation, um, and it might also help with improving budgets and funding for programs. So there are lots of different benefits, but also like prepare yourself for the potential challenges. So if you have any questions, I know we went over a lot, but this is just a quick overview. So if you have any questions, feel free to email me, and yeah. Thank you so much.